Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar for Standard Drafters, today, Friday, the 27th of October. And today's topic for this webinar is the procedures at the voting and publication stages for Vienna and Frankfurt Agreement projects. Now, there's been a slight change to the presenting lineup. So today you've got me. I'm Matthew Tomlin, and I'm the current manager of the Standards Publications Unit. So basically, I'm very happy to have the pleasure of your company this afternoon. As usual, during these webinars, do get in touch with us using the question and answers panel that you'll find now that you're logged in. You can share your thoughts and experiences and suggestions with us. And time permitting, I will respond to any questions at the end of the webinar that you may have on the topic. And if you'd like to re-watch the webinar and have an overview of the question and answers from today's session, well, these will be published online on the CEN-CENELEC website in the following path, as you can see there in front on the screen. So let's make a start. So as an introduction, I'd like to just set the context. So as you know, we have two standard making organisations on the European level, CEN and CENELEC. And at international level, we also have the two main organisations, ISO and IEC. And of course, at national level, we have all the various national standardization organisations. Now, these NSOs at national level are members of CEN and CENELEC and work with us together. And of course, the NSOs are also members at international level of ISO or IEC. Now, the Europeans and the international standardization organizations work together. As you can see, there is a link here, and we work together through these agreements, through the Vienna Agreement for ISO and CEN, and the Frankfurt Agreement for IEC and CENELEC. So that's setting the context. Let me talk now in detail specifically about the Vienna Agreement. And to begin with, I have some facts and figures. So what is the Vienna Agreement? Well, basically it's a formal agreement on technical cooperation between ISO and CEN. When cooperation is to occur, there has to be a formal decision on both sides by the technical committees to work and develop standardization deliverables in parallel. What about the history? Well, back in 1991, the first Vienna Agreement was published. There was a revision in 2001, and then later in 2016, some very useful guidelines on the implementation were published. And why the Vienna Agreement? Well, three main reasons: to avoid the duplication of work at both international and European levels, to promote the global economy, and to ensure the rational use of the back office resources, both here in Brussels for CEN and in Geneva for ISO. And just an overview of the CEN portfolio in relation to ISO. It's thanks to the Vienna Agreement that roughly 1/3 of CEN's portfolio is identical to international standards. And just an overview, in case you were wondering, here's a breakdown of the percentage of deliverables per business domain, where the CEN publications are identical to ISO publications. And here we see that the major sectors involved are those of materials, environment, food, and primarily healthcare. So, there are different modalities of cooperation in the Vienna Agreement, and the first being information exchange between CCMC and ISO Central Secretariat. And this is basically the exchange of things like database extracts, procedural issues, reporting, and statistics. Really technical and policy related collaboration. Next, there is a cooperation by correspondence, and this is really the exchange of documents between technical committees such as meeting reports and draft standards. Also, any ISO member, even non-European ISO members, may comment on any CEN PREN at the inquiry stage, and they can submit their comments to CCMC, who will forward them, provide them to the responsible CEN technical committee. There's also, within the Vienna Agreement, the aspect of representation in meetings, and there are provisions allowing up to 4 representatives of a committee to attend meetings of a technical committee of the other organisation. And then the last 2 aspects of the cooperation under the Vienna Agreement are the adoption of available publications and the parallel development of common deliverables. And I'm going to go into those in detail now. So let's first look at the adoption of available publications. So both in ISO and CEN, each organisation can adopt each other's published standards by submitting them to their own procedures. In CEN, if a technical committee wishes to adopt a published ISO standard and bring it onto the European level, we will follow the inquiry and formal vote procedure. So that will imply an 8-week translation for the German version of the standard, followed by the usual 12-week inquiry vote. Following the outcome of that vote, the formal vote can be skipped and the EN-ISO can be published. Now, ideally, the international standard being adopted should be adopted without any change. We're looking to have identical standards at both levels. However, if changes are needed, then there are 2 options. If a CEN technical body sees an ISO text that they wish to adopt on the European level, but feel the need that something inside the text should be changed, they have the option of contacting the ISO secretary responsible for the publication to see whether they can accept a revision of the content of the standard to take into account the changes foreseen at European level, and then we can have a parallel processed revision of the ISO standard. This is the preferred route. If that can't be achieved, then it is possible in CEN to adopt an ISO standard but have a modified version of that publication. And that will be then a pure EN with a different reference number. It will contain the identical text of the ISO standard, but where it's modified, that will be indicated in the margin using lines to represent where modification has been made. I've got an example here of a simple, straightforward adoption of a published ISO in CEN. So here we have an EN from one specific technical committee, and this was published in 2006. And the TC then decided to revise their European standard by adopting an existing ISO standard. So they took a TC decision to create a new work item. And here's the international standard that they wanted to adopt. As you can see, if you can read the title, it's about fine ceramics, but both standards cover pretty much the same topic. So the European Committee wanted to adopt the published standard to replace the existing EN. Once the TC had created their new work item, they uploaded a transmission notice onto eTrans, and then CCMC started the process of launching the inquiry, as I said before, by issuing translation request for 8 weeks and then triggering a 12-week inquiry at CEN level to adopt the ISO standard. And it was approved and published as EN ISO 17142 of 2016, and it replaced the existing EN. And here is a screenshot of the cover page of that EN ISO. Something that's worth noting here that in CEN, This published document that you see in front of you only consists of a title page, a European forward, which contains an endorsement notice, and possibly an Annex ZA if the standard is linked to any European Union legislation. It's currently the individual CEN members who attach the full text of the ISO standard to this EN-ISO cover page when they implement and publish at national level. So next, we'll have a look at the parallel development of standards. So when parallel work starts, there has to be an agreement between both the International and the European Technical Committee. There's an identification of a lead organisation, and in the Vienna Agreement it's stipulated that the preferred lead is that of having the ISO TC leading the work. A new work item approval is needed in both CEN and ISO. And then there is the parallel inquiry, and the ISO Central Secretariat ensures that that is done in parallel with CEN by providing CCMC with a notification of the target dates for launching the inquiry, so that we here at CCMC can ensure that we open our inquiry ballot at the same time as ISO do. And the duration of the parallel inquiry is 12 weeks long. Following the outcome of the inquiry, as you are aware, it is possible to skip the next step, the formal vote. In ISO, it's default skipping the formal vote, the FDIS, whereas in CEN, a technical body decision is required. So if the International Technical Committee decides to move straight to publication, there's an obligation on the side of the CEN Technical Committee to take a decision to skip the parallel formal vote. If there is a parallel formal vote, then the same events happen as for the parallel inquiry. Basically, ISO will notify CCMC of the forecasted dates for starting the parallel ballot, and that is 8 weeks in duration. And then following the outcome, positive outcome, then we have a parallel publication of the EN-ISO at the same time, more or less as the international standard. And again, we work through a system of notifications from ISO to ensure that we have a parallel publication. Then, of course, we go full circle, and there will be at some point the need for a revision or an amendment of the standard. And when that occurs, there is a default of ISO lead. And in addition, there is a standing technical board decision that states that automatically a new work item has to be created in the work program of the CEN Technical Committee in order to go in parallel with the ISO revision or amendment. So basically, there's no need for a CEN Technical Committee to take a decision for a new work item for a revision or amendment of an existing EN-ISO standard. Also to note here, as you probably guessed already, all the management of the allocation of the dates and of the editing and even of the translation is handled by the team in ISO Central Secretariat in Geneva. And as I said, we work through a system of notifications so that the parallel aspects are triggered in CEN. And ultimately, CEN publishes a European forward, and together with any annexes that might be required for the European level. Now, I've got another sort of basic overview of the process, and this shows the main actions that are undertaken by ISO, the CEN-TC and CCMC. And I include here a mention of the Annex ZA, which is necessary for any candidate harmonized work. So let's just go through this. At new work item moment, at ISO level, a new work item is created in the work program of the international technical body, and the development of the DIS draft starts. At the technical committee level in CEN, a new work item is required, so a decision is required for the new work item. And if there is if the project is expected to support European Union legislation, i.e. it's a candidate harmonized standard, then the CEN technical body is responsible for developing the Annex ZA. At CCMC, we check the new work item data to ensure that there is consistency and correct information regarding any link to European Union legislation. Next, the parallel inquiry DIS stage. So this is the draft international standard stage. At ISO, as I mentioned, there is the work done in terms of editing, management of translation, and launching the procedure. And where there is the need for an Annex ZA for EU legislation links, then it is the responsibility of the CEN Technical Committee to provide ISO with this Annex ZA, because ISO includes the draft Annex ZA in the DIS text as an annex. And at CCMC, we will ensure that the ballot is launched in CEN with the same dates as the ISO ballot, and if there is any link with candidate harmonized work, we will trigger the assessment with the new approach consultant. As you'll see on the left, there's a possibility to skip FDIS, but if FDIS does take place, then pretty much the same events occur as ISO, the editing and the translation of the FDIS draft. Again, the CEN technical body responsible for providing ISO CS with the Annex ZA content, and at CCMC we ensure a parallel ballot and we contact the consultant if the project is candidate harmonized. And finally, at publication, we see here that ISO will publish the ISO standard, and here at CCMC we ensure that in CEN the equivalent EN ISO standard is published at the same time, and we include the text of the Annex ZA in our EN ISO standard. ISO remove it from their published standard and we take it into our EN ISO publication. Whoa, there we have the overview, and that's it for the Vienna Agreement. So let's look at the Frankfurt Agreement. Some facts and figures to begin with. What is the Frankfurt Agreement? Well, it's an agreement on the common planning of new work and parallel voting between ISO and CENELEC. Now, there is therefore no decision needed by the CENELEC Technical Committee to go in parallel with IEC. It happens systematically, almost automatically. The purpose of the Frankfurt Agreement is to have almost every IEC standard passed through CENELEC. Of course, there are some exceptions that are decided on by the CENELEC Technical Board. Bit of history, it was signed back in 1996 and it was signed as the Dresden Agreement. But in 2016, the new agreement was signed in the city of Frankfurt and hence the new name. There's also some guidance on the management, the day-to-day management of the Frankfurt Agreement, and that is coming soon. It is in the process of being drafted and approved. And why have the Frankfurt Agreement? Well, it's basically underlining the commitment between the two organisations to undertake work at primarily international level. It will help promote the global economy, and like the Vienna Agreement, it ensures the rational use of back office resources. And we can see that in light of the Frankfurt Agreement and the fact that it's quite of a different nature to the Vienna Agreement, we see a much larger percentage of CENELEC work identical to IEC work, almost 2/3. Let's look at the modalities of the Frankfurt Agreement. There are three main modalities. There's the common planning of new work items, the parallel voting on international standards, and there's the conversion of European standards into international standards. So let's look at the first and the third modalities there. So the principle of the Frankfurt Agreement is that CENELEC will offer to IEC all new work items of future projects of European origin, and even of all published European work. These are known as EWIs. Now, how does this work? Well, any projects that are started within CENELEC are offered to the IEC. There are sometimes exceptions. IEC will look into whether they are ready to actually take on board the work that is started at CENELEC level. If IEC accepts a new work item, then the work is stopped in CENELEC and then developed in parallel under the Frankfurt Agreement. If IEC is not interested in taking the work on board, then the work will continue within CENELEC. But any publication of a CENELEC European standard will be offered to IEC with the aim of having it adopted by them as an international standard. Let's look at the parallel voting for the Frankfurt Agreement. So IEC draft and final draft standards are, as I said, systematically submitted to a parallel voting procedure in CENELEC. The first stage is that of the committee draft for vote at IEC, and in CENELEC we have an equivalent parallel vote on CDV. And again, like the Vienna Agreement, we work with our colleagues at IEC Central Office through means of notification, and they will inform us when they plan on starting the vote on the CDV. And the duration of the parallel vote on CDV is 12 weeks long. Now, it might be that the European Technical Committee, mirroring the international one, sees the need for common modifications. So basically they see that there is a need to change some aspects of the draft, the CDV draft, to accommodate specific European needs. And if they see that that's necessary, then they can draft these common modifications and submit them to CCMC to ensure that when CENELEC starts the parallel vote on the CDV, we include a vote also on the proposed common modifications. The next step is the FDIS stage, and this is in brackets because, again, it could be that following the CDV, we can go straight to publication. But if there is the need for an FDIS, then the IEC colleagues will inform us at CCMC of the proposed voting dates, and those are of a duration of 6 weeks in IEC. And again, common modifications necessary to accommodate specific European needs should be submitted to CCMC from the European CENELEC Technical Committee. The last step being publication. Once IEC has published the international standard, the equivalent European standard is then set on track for publication. And it's either going to be identical if there are no common modifications, or if there are, then it is labelled as an EN modified. Again, I've got a basic process overview, also looking at the aspect of candidate harmonized work. So let's have a look at this together. The first step being the new work item creation. IEC will ensure the creation of a new work item in the work programme of the international technical body, and they will start developing the CDV, that should read draft, or CD draft. At the CENELEC level, there is a need to take into account a possible Annex ZZ if there are any links between the project and European Union legislation. And of course, if there's a need for common modifications, the CENELEC Technical Committee should look into drafting these. On the CCMC side, the new work item is created automatically in the database, and the responsible program manager will check the data attached to that new work item. The next step is the CDV stage. So IEC is responsible for the editing, translation and the launch of the CDV. At CENELEC technical body level, they should provide CCMC with any common modifications that are needed, and if there's a link with the EU legislation, they should provide CCMC with the related Annex ZZ. It's a bit different to the Vienna Agreement because IEC do not include the Annex ZZ in their international standard. We will circulate it to the CENELEC members, and we will also contact the consultant if needed. Again, at EFTIS stage, the same aspects happen. So the work of editing is done at IEC, and they trigger the launch of the parallel EFTIS by informing CENELEC of the launch dates, and CCMC will ensure that the ballot is opened and that if needed, the consultant is contacted. Again, the CENELEC Technical Committee is responsible for providing the Annex ZZ to CCMC, and if there are any common modifications, the text of that also. And then finally, we arrive at publication stage, and there again, IEC publish their international standard, and CENELEC will publish the EN, which consists of a title page, European forward, and the European annexes. I've got an example of a very straightforward parallel publication. Here's a cover page of the international standard that went through a parallel development, and here is the equivalent EN with exactly the same title and reference there. Now, I have an example also of a parallel IEC project with European modifications. So this is the international standard that the CENELEC that went in parallel under the Frankfurt Agreement, and here we see the resulting EN standard. However, it is not an equivalent standard. You might make out there in the title that in brackets it says modified, and that's because the European technical body submitted common modifications that were voted on and approved by the CENELEC members, and they are found in the body of the EN version. After the endorsement notice there, you see the common modifications, and it is a simple list of what needs to be changed in the content of the international standard and taken into account for Europe. Now, we have some reference documents which you might find of use. For the Vienna Agreement on the CEN-BOSS platform, we've got some reference material listed here in front of you. You can access the actual Vienna Agreement, the guidelines, some frequently asked question overview, and there's a specific document for the day-to-day management between ISO and CCMC. We've got also a French translation of a couple of those documents. For the Frankfurt Agreement, as I mentioned before, coming very soon, we will have some guidance documents to support the community in CENELEC. There will be a day-to-day management of the Frankfurt Agreement document, and there will also be an overview of the most frequently asked questions on the application of the Frankfurt Agreement.